Good afternoon, everyone, and a happy new year. We hope that you all managed to get a bit of a restful break over Christmas and New Year, and now gearing up for vintage and a whole new 2022. As many of you know, my name is Prue Klein, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator here at Wine Communicators of Australia. Today is our first webinar for the year, and we're really excited to have Michael Parks, Sustainability Director at Treasury Wine Estates, joining us. Today, Michael will be talking about how Treasury decided on its ambitious sustainability goals, as well as the challenges and opportunities it presents to the broader wine industry. We've allowed plenty of time for, I'm sure, the many questions you have to ask of Michael to be answered at the end of the webinar. However, feel free to send them through to me as they come to mind. You can do this via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. As usual, this webinar is recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you should you wish to watch it at a later stage. It is now my pleasure to hand over to you, Michael, for today's presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thanks Prue, and to Wine Communicators of Australia for having me here today. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting. I'm joining from Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as any other Aboriginal people on the call today. So I thought today I'd talk to a few things. I'd like to provide some insights into how Treasury is ramping up its sustainability ambition, something which we call cultivating a brighter future, and why we think that's important. I'd like to give some examples of recent investments we've made in the sustainability space, and give a sense of some of the emerging challenges that the industry will have to face into the future. But before we begin, a little also about me. So as Prue said, I'm Director of Sustainability at Treasury Wine. I've been working in sustainability in various guises for coming up to sort of 15, 20 years, something like that. And I guess when I was at uni, I always knew what I wanted to do. It just didn't really exist yet. So a blend of science and commerce has given me the foundations to tic-tac across various forms of government and roles to arrive in the UK pre-GFC at what I would say was a pretty serious inflection point in sustainability. And I think we're at another one of those now, 15 years later. So very exciting times. About 12 years ago, I came back to Australia. I spent some time in banking, and most recently I spent about 9 years at Telstra, where I headed up the strategy and inclusion team. I've been with Treasury for just under a year now, and I'm often asked what attracted me to Treasury. And there's a few things. As part of the interview process, I got to spend some time with Tim Ford, our CEO, and I was impressed. Too often these meetings with senior execs are squeezed. You don't get the chance to ask the questions, or when you do, it's clear the answers have been put through the comms team. And Tim's one of those leaders who feels sustainability in his bones, and that's critical to progress. If you don't have senior leader buy-in, a tough job becomes even harder, if not impossible. Secondly, if I think about wine, it really is the product of a particular set of circumstances, the terroir, or the soil, temperature, rain, farming practices, and so on. And now that it's clear that a number of those fundamental variables start to shift around, the impact on things like yield and quality can be pretty significant. So the opportunity to do something significant for Treasury and the industry was a pretty attractive one. It's also nice not to be harassed by friends and family about their internet or phone issues. So a year is pretty fresh, particularly in an industry that seems to have people with incredible passion and therefore long tenures. So I also wanted to give you a sense of some of my initial observations about sustainability in the wine industry. The wine industry has long recognised the need to be responsible stewards of the land and water. And as a consumer, I don't think I really appreciated the depth of that commitment and how important it is. More recently, it's been super pleasing to see the interest with which Sustainable Wine Grown Australia and its certification scheme is receiving of late in respect of that. I knew a little, I guess, about the care with which producers needed to balance all the inputs and the environmental factors, but I never really appreciated the need to predict the future, for example, to get irrigation schedules right. And not to mention, you can do that right all season, but still be at the mercy of nature. So an incredibly stressful industry at the same time. Also from a sectoral perspective, I think wine's really interesting in terms of, if you look at it through the lens of the agriculture industry, it's pretty small. Similarly, if you look at it through, the alcoholic beverages industry, we're very small in terms of scale. Again, through fast-moving consumer goods, we're very small. And I think that represents real challenges to the industry in terms of trying to influence and shift suppliers and so forth. But definitely we are big in certain areas. We contribute a lot through taxes. We're a large regional employers. We drive significant amounts of tourism and so on. But it also suggests to me that collective action as industry, as procurers, through industry bodies and so on, is the only way we can shift the needle on some of the big challenges we're looking at. We need to function as an ecosystem. So moving on to Treasury Wine Estates, it probably needs little introduction, but we're one of the world's largest wine companies listed on the ASX, and our ambition is to be the world's most admired premium wine company. And one of the ways we're aiming to achieve that is by our commitment to sustainability. This means we're going to focus on long-term value creation and innovation, as well as committing to leadership and collective action to ensure we're effectively able to manage the risks and make the most of new emerging opportunities. With that in mind, we've established 3 focus areas for our sustainability agenda. These focus areas respond to each of our material topics, and there's the inner slices that you can see in the diagram just up on the screen. The first focus area is about building a more resilient business. And this acknowledges that our ability to deliver over the long term, to thrive over the long term, our business needs to be resilient in the face of increasing uncertainty, complexity and change. Being able to adapt to the trends that are impacting our business, such as climate change and water scarcity, require new ways of thinking, innovation and new partnerships. Importantly, it's also about rewiring the business so that we make the right calls on what were traditionally seen as environmental issues, but these are now fundamental to our success. The second goal is about fostering healthy, inclusive communities, and this is where the importance of people comes to life in our strategy, both as an employer and as a member of the community. And a healthy and safe workplace, it will always be our first priority. But behind every bottle of wine that we produce is a team that's passionate about building an inclusive and equitable culture that delivers better outcomes for all stakeholders. And as part of this, we want to foster safe, sociable and connected communities where our brands are promoted and our wine consumed safely and responsibly. The third focus area is our goal to produce sustainable wine. And as one of the world's largest wine companies, we believe we're well positioned to lead substantive change within our supply chain and with our business partners. We want every consumer to experience wine that is sustainably grown, made and packaged. And our efforts here will span from ensuring our asset base and grower network meets sustainability criteria through to joint innovation on some of the shared challenges. Now, in support of these focus areas, we've developed what I would say is an ambitious suite of targets and initiatives that commit us to leading by example and building trust through clear reporting of our progress. And this slide steps through each of our 8 material topics and the targets we've set to improve performance or prepare for the future in each of these critical areas. Just as an aside, for those not familiar, material topics are the ones that are most important to us as a business and our stakeholders. And so out of all the universe of possible issues that we could care about, these are the topics that are most aligned and will allow us to differentiate most in the market. And as you'll see for some, like inclusion and diversity, we absolutely know where we want to get to. 50% women in senior leadership, very hard quantitative target. Others, like water, we need to review and think through a number of dimensions before we can start to set quantitative improvement targets. These are all in our 2021 sustainability report. So if you're interested, please go and have a look. And there's a lot more detail. I won't go through them in effort today. And I should make the point that this presentation will be fairly available for whoever's interested. So just reach out. Now, the questions may emerge as to why we're doing this, but there's a range of reasons, and it's increasingly clear business is expected to fill the void left by governments and inequality around the world. One dimension of this is the UN SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, which you can see on the right-hand side of the slide there. And these are really an articulation by the UN of the world we want to live in by 2030. And they are essentially undeniable, clean water, access to food, medicine, education, and so on, things that many of us take for granted. But I think they're also an acknowledgement that the environmental and social are intrinsically linked to economic outcomes. And the last 2 years of the pandemic have shown this in frightening detail for many of us. Now, governments around the world have signed up to these, and as we get closer to 2030, it's going to be really interesting to see how much progress we're making or not. And I'd say these are a really useful lens to apply to your business to see how you're contributing to that future or not. But also on the left-hand side there's a range of other stakeholders who are keenly interested in our sustainability performance and demanding more from us. Consumers, especially younger ones, are increasingly voting with their wallets. Our employees tell us how proud they are of our sustainability work. They love it, and they want to know more about what we're doing, how we're contributing. And for investors, it's now becoming mainstream. And for Treasury to be considered a good investment, we have to demonstrate to investors how we're sustaining the environment now and into the future. An important part of our commitment to sustainability is the recent refinancing of our debt, which we did just prior to Christmas. Some $1.4 billion was refinanced under a sustainability-linked loan. Now, this type of loan structure effectively incentivises us to work towards agreed sustainability performance outcomes. And if we reach them, our cost of capital is reduced. The reverse is also true. So it's really great example of us putting our money where our mouth is. I thought now I'd sort of hone in on climate change in particular as that is a pressing global problem and one of particular relevance to the wine industry and something that I know is occupying a lot of time and minds around the world. So as a business with a global agricultural footprint, we really understand the importance of managing these critical impacts and ongoing risks associated with climate change. As a business, we accept the international scientific consensus and support the objective of the Paris Agreement, which is to keep global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably much closer to 1.5 degrees. As I'm sure many of you are aware, viticulture, much like the rest of the agricultural sector, is very sensitive to frequent extreme weather events as well as changing climatic patterns. Which can influence many factors which are incredibly important for us to do what we do, things like water availability, temperature, precipitation, timing of harvest, and so on. And indeed, some of the acute events, the acute physical events like wildfires we've witnessed throughout South Australia and California and in recent years are testament to this. So we believe we have a responsibility to be part of the journey towards a zero carbon economy, whilst also managing the critical impacts of climate change on our business. Now, while no one person or entity can tackle climate change alone, business leaders have a platform to support their own organisations' climate transformation efforts and engage their employees in meaningful action, as well as advocating for action to take steps to fight climate change, as well as collaborating and innovating on those solutions. And so as a result, our approach is generally sitting on 3 levels. Firstly, we're playing our part and we've committed to the rapid decarbonisation of our business. Initially, we're aiming to be 100% renewable electricity by the end of 2024. This is a pretty aggressive timeframe and focuses on what's called our Scope 2 emissions, which are those associated with electricity, obviously. And we're going to achieve this by a mixture of on-site solar, green electricity, and retiring of certificates. Next, we've set the goal to become net zero for our direct operations by 2030, which means we will then focus on the Scope 1 emissions, and they're things related to bits of equipment that we own and operate, like our tractors and gas boilers and so on. Now, these are a bit harder to shift and require, a bit of delicate sort of timing in terms of asset life cycles and the things like that. So we've given ourselves a bit more time to deal with these, but again, 2030 is relatively aggressive, and these targets combined are more than Paris aligned, which means that we are more than playing our part towards decarbonising the globe. Importantly, I think we're also starting to look at our Scope 3 emissions, and that is the emissions that occur upstream and downstream of our business. So things like the packaging and transport of our goods to customers and so on. And these are even harder to shift than those Scope 1s, really relying on influence. And that's where that point around collective action and the industry working together is going to be really important. In the middle there, we're adapting our business to be able to respond to the predicted shifts in temperature, water availability and extreme events. Our business strategy, which is predominantly focused on adaptive sourcing, is already climate resilient. It allows us to source the best grapes each year. But critically, we also need to identify and implement the right adaptation response, our global portfolio, to complement this business strategy. To inform this action, we're undertaking a global climate scenario analysis that will identify the range of weather conditions we're likely to experience across our operations in the future, and assessing that for risk, and doing that from the bottom up. And then we'll use these findings to really inform what the menu of options that might be applied in each of our operations. So, things like canopy management techniques, increased data and forecasting ability, even optimizing irrigation and so on. An important part of this is that there's no silver bullet to adapt in your business, that there's going to be a myriad of options that you need to deploy at the site level. And so we need to build our understanding of those. And part of building that understanding is collaborating and innovating with a range of partners, whether it be universities and industry experts, to increase our understanding of these options and identify new alternatives. The final component is that we've really committed to keeping stakeholders informed. We want to demonstrate how we're managing the risk and making the most of the opportunities that changing climate presents. So we've begun to align our reporting with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that's the TCFD. And this really asks organisations to report against the governance, the strategy, the risk management and targets that they're using in regards to climate change. We also recently rejoined RE100, which is a global initiative that brings together the world's most influential businesses that are committed to 100% renewable electricity. This shift to renewable electricity is the single biggest move I think that the wine industry can make in responding to their direct climate change impacts. To put that in perspective, at Treasury, electricity accounts for about 70% of our direct emissions, that is our scope 1 and 2. And so you can see that, in less than 2 years, we'll have moved very significantly towards reducing most of our current emissions profile. I thought I'd just spend a few minutes now just talking to some of our recent investments. Now, vintage compression is one of the sort of artifacts, if you like, of a warming climate, and they're going to become more frequent. And what that means is grape varieties that have historically been harvested at separate times are now starting to coincide. And indeed, regions which were once delivered at the winery to different times are now starting to overlap, which means there's a very big sort of pressure point in terms of being able to process your grapes effectively. We recently spent a significant amount of money investing in the Tweed Barossa winery, and part of that expansion was designed to provide increased fermentation capacity when those vintages are compressed. This really gives us the capacity to protect the highest value luxury fruit and ensure they get the right cycle times to make the best wine possible. Underpinning all of this is investment in data and predictive technology and AI. So using predictive software to help forecast the ripening of the fruit. This provides us with really critical insights as to how to optimally schedule the vintage process into the winery, not only for efficiency purposes, but also to ensure we keep a very good eye on the quality of wine produced. Just moving on now to another sort of outcome of our expansion of Tweed Barossa, Tweed Winery in the Barossa is this Cultivating Dam. And I touched on it briefly, but one of the realities, I guess, of climate change in many parts of the world, and this is generally speaking, of course, is that it's going to be warmer and drier. And so in recognition of this, as I spoke to earlier, we've committed to a strategic review of our global water assets and use. And we feel this is the right time to really start thinking about those longer term issues in terms of how we, have a very good eye on how we use our water across our sites, where we lose water across our sites, how we might more efficiently manage water across our sites. That review is underway, but we're not waiting rather to make those sensible investments. And this is one that just makes perfect sense. The Cultivating Dam effectively increases our water holdings by about 360 megalitres in the Barossa. The source for this is treated winery effluent as well as stormwater, so stuff that would have traditionally just been lost in the system. And this means that when La Nina does retreat, which it will do, we'll have even greater resilience, particularly for our most prized vines. And we also have greater flexibility to support those community uses, which is a really important part of being a good water steward, is making sure that the community around you has access to this precious resource as well, which helps ensure local amenities maintained. It's part of being a good neighbour and a force for good in the community, investments like these, particularly when they make such good commercial sense. Moving on to some of the emerging challenges that I think the industry at large will have to face into. Consumers are really demanding sustainability and increasingly demonstrating this with their purchasing choices. And we can see very strong signals coming from our more mature markets in terms of what they expect. And it won't be too long before Australia catches up, particularly in that younger demographic. Now, you couple that with the fact that effectively communicating sustainability is hard. That is, the messages are sometimes complicated, they're interrelated, and not least of all, Australians are generally a pretty sceptical bunch. And so when you combine those two things, it's a pretty big challenge and something we all need to work on, and I think is particularly important for this group. But I think there's a few important steps that can be made. So firstly, certification. Third-party certification is a well-proven way to enhance trust in action. In fact, the same markets across the Nordics and Europe that are leaders in sustainability and are demanding more from us are also those where trust marks and certifications are more common. This fact alone should be enough to push many more producers and brands down this path. Secondly, I think we want to make it as easy as possible for consumers who want to make sustainable choices, whether that be through better information on the pack or easy to find information online and things like that. Globally, there's been a proliferation of sustainability-based certifications for wine, regionally or GI-based or focused on specific issues. And all of them are looking at, slightly different things, but there's a lot of harmony and between them. But it's really great to see the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia certification to be one of the most, if not the most expansive of these, which means we have a really great starting position in terms of where we might go in the future. But when you look at that through, that reality, that dynamic of, proliferation of standards through consumers globally, you can see that makes the task of choosing sustainable wine that much harder. And that's why Treasury recently became a founding member of the Sustainable Wine Roundtable, which is a global initiative involving, I think it's about 40 stakeholders from across the wine value chain, from producers to key suppliers to customers and certification bodies. And they're all really aimed at trying to arrive at some kind of consensus in defining sustainability, as well as sharing ideas and best practice along the way. In my mind, these multi-stakeholder collaborations are really interesting. I think they're likely the most effective way in an industry like ours to get traction, and I'm really excited to see what's possible. So if you haven't heard about it, I encourage you to go and have a look online and get involved. Moving on to the final point is just around alternative packaging formats. And, they've been getting a lot of attention of late, and for good reason. I think the carbon impact of glass is very well known amongst the industry, and it accounts for the majority of emissions, some 40% of a bottle of wine. And we as an industry need to face into that, and indeed we might have our hand forced by environmentally conscious consumers, or it could be regulatory impost via things like container deposit schemes, or indeed just the reality that a can of wine can also play a role in promoting responsible drinking. We need to think really deeply about how we evolve consumer preferences, and educate them why that's a sensible choice. But I think this is the right group to have that sort of discussion. Talking about wine is the art of storytelling, and that same thinking needs to come to talking about sustainability. And that's something this group is very well placed to do. I've flown through my presentation today, and that's all I wanted to cover. I hope I've left, I've definitely left plenty of time for questions. So look, feel free to reach out directly if you've got any, but thanks for having me. And I'll just hand over to Prue, who will moderate the Q&A for us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael, for what I consider was a very aspirational presentation today. And congratulations to you and the team at, I noticed you said TWE as a little acronym there. I haven't heard that one, but Treasury Wine Estates for the time and money you're investing into sustainability. And it's a pretty exciting vision that you have for the future. And I'm sure that there's lots of people just sitting there going, wow. And you touched on it at the end there, but my first question for you is, where is that starting point? Like, is it reaching out to those bodies that you referred to on that last slide? If someone's really wanting to, obviously Treasury is a huge company with a lot of money to invest. If we're a small to medium-sized business, how can they take those first steps?
Yeah, look, I think, we're really lucky here in Australia to have Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, and they're not just their certification scheme, but their kind of member resources and the like is just a really, very sensible starting point that's very holistic in terms of, looking at the land, looking at the pesticide use, looking at the labour and looking at, biodiversity and all the important things that, producers, big or small, should be considering when they're thinking about how to improve their sustainability. And so, yeah, just really encourage people to go and jump on the website. A lot of it is freely available, and think about, that dynamic of, very significant shifts in consumer preferences and how you can start to prepare your business for that future, and start to have that conversation with your consumers and customers.
Fantastic, absolutely. We've had a couple of questions coming in while we've been chatting, Michael. Justina's just asked, it would be great to hear your ideas on how we can work together to evolve consumer preferences when it comes to wine packaging and formats.
Yeah, look, I'm sure there's plenty of smarter brains out there than mine, but I think there is this information gap, if you like. So on one hand, you've got lots of studies, and there's a few that sort of spring to mind that basically they say during the pandemic there was statistics like Australians are more worried about climate change than they are about COVID, and that was from I think March 2020, which is quite surprising. There's another one, GlobeScan, who's been tracking climate change for about 20 years now, and it's essentially the pinnacle, if you like, of consumer interest and action around that. And I think in Australia, in some ways, the bushfires had led us to a great sort of area of interest, and then the pandemic came along and kind of took the air out of it a little bit. And I suspect once the pandemic subsides, climate change will be right back up on the agenda. And so I think we need to leverage that sort of interest. We need to leverage that through education. And the challenge is how do we do that as a community, as a group. And that's why I think this forum is really important, to sort of have those discussions and come up with those ideas that there's the QR codes is probably one great example where 2 years ago they were sort of seen as a dead and dying beast, and now everyone's au fait with how to use them. And so is it starting to explain about via on-pack QR codes about why this packaging choice has been made, or you like. I really do think that producers do need to take a leap of faith in some ways. I mean, there are some challenges around, the sensory and the shelf life, if you like, of some of those alternative formats. But providing guarantees or money back guarantees, if you like, if it's not up to scratch, given that we know most wines in those sub $15 mark are probably consumed within a few weeks of purchase anyway, that it's a relatively low risk for the industry to take into. And I think that's an interesting path to go down.
Absolutely. And with like packaging and formats that are more sustainable, are you finding that you can source them locally in Australia, or has Treasury had to go overseas to some of those countries that maybe are more innovative in this space to supply?
Yeah, look, I think the market here is evolving, but evolving pretty rapidly. Certainly, if we look to the Nordic markets, for example, bag in box is the preferred packaging choice. And it kind of makes sense if you think about Sweden, the land of IKEA, right? It's modular, it packs well. The particular system they have there with the government-run monopolies means that there aren't, this proliferation of liquor stores, so you do need to travel into, larger sort of shopping centres to get your alcohol, and therefore carrying can be a challenge. And so, I think our 3-litre Lindemans is one of the biggest sellers over there for that very reason. And then their post-consumer recycling infrastructure is more advanced as well. So they can actually recycle lots of things like Tetra Paks and the things that we can't actually do over here in Australia yet. So I think there's a lot to learn from those sort of European markets. And I would also say that, some of it's not easy. There are some trade-offs to be made, for example, around, paper bottles, for example, which could be using, virgin paper fibre, as they do now. How do you sort of trade that off against, say, a can, which could be recycled, and all these sorts of things. And so every business needs to kind of plot its own path, I guess, in terms of what it values. Is it valuing carbon, recyclability? And, I'm a big fan of saying things, the orthodoxy is not settled, if you like, on those alternative formats. And I think there is a lot more work to be done. But I think engaging with suppliers and letting them know you're interested and trying to find out what's out there is just going to spark more innovation and more development within that sort of sphere, which is, I think, going to be really important for us as an industry.
Absolutely. Michael, we've got a question from Richard. He's asking, what is TWE's attitude towards container deposit schemes for wine bottles now being reviewed Australia-wide? Most wine bottles in Vic, for instance, end up as road fill after one use.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We've got targets to increase the recycled content of our wine bottles, and so it's, on one level, you absolutely have to support it in terms of we know that a step towards making glass more environmentally friendly is increasing the recycled content. And so, on that level, it kind of makes sense. But we also know that container deposit schemes do impose, cost on producers, and, larger organisations like Treasury probably have more capacity to, be able to weather those costs and absorb them into, across larger product lines. And so, that impost does fall, on smaller producers more so, who may not be able to sort of weather that, and the margins of the wine they produce may be a lot lower. And so I think there needs to be, a very much an eyes open approach to how you move down the path towards container deposit schemes. I see them, personally as an opportunity to, if your, wines where you're not making much margin are suddenly going to increase in costs by, how many cents per bottle, that's an opportunity for you to try something different, particularly in that, those, lower tier categories where they're going to be consumed quickly, and try those alternative formats that, may allow you to sidestep the container deposit scheme.
Yeah.
But I think we can all agree that, we all want to kind of make the right environmental choices, and increasing recycled content is a good step forward. But, there are, various challenges in the industry about where those beneficiation plants may be versus where the cullet may be. And so I think there's, much bigger structural questions that also need to be addressed at the same time as, imposing container deposit schemes. Which is sort of easy to cover off.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. I've got another question regarding internal challenges about setting up your strategy. This person's asked, what have been some of the internal challenges you've faced, e.g. balancing with commercial pressures, getting everyone on board, agreeing with this new way forward as a company?
Yeah, no, that's sometimes the internal challenges can be some of the hardest ones. And
yes.
And that's particularly, as I mentioned at the start, as part of the process, I met with Tim because, essentially if the CEO and your senior leadership's not on board, then you do have a really hard time of things moving as quickly as we have been able to. And that's what I would sort of suggest has made the road much easier at Treasury. And that has been a challenge in many other organisations, in that sort of senior leader buy-in, because that does unlock the doors, if you like. So in terms of the challenges, I think they're no different to what you'd find in other organisations. Treasury had set the ambition. It wants to be a leader. It wants to be a leader not just in the wine industry, but the beverage sector. And the question is, how do you sort of start to do that in a way that's going to not break the bank, and allow the business to keep kind of doing what it does well, but just sort of accent on the things that are really important. So some of the challenges at the moment have been around being able to fill the roles we have available. So we've sort of really built the capability of the team in terms of, building the size and the remit of people who operate in the sustainability space. We've done that through secondments, but the market for sustainability professionals is extremely hot right now. It's been quite challenging to fill a couple of key roles, which has meant that, you're not moving as quickly as you can. The other, I guess, point is that when you look at it through, the lens of, non-financial data, this is sort of, if you like, the cornerstone of sustainability, about how you make, decisions and, get insight into what's working. Financial data has been through, hundreds of years of standardization and there's generally agreed accounting principles about how you do things, less so around the non-financial. And so trying to kind of create that environment of, integrity of data and things like that is just a challenge, regardless of which business you're in that, you do have to sort of, plot your own way a little bit, and you can have regard to all the standards, but every business is slightly different and set up. And so making sure that you can manage that non-financial data in a way that really works for you and is sensible and doesn't tie you down in knots is just a never-ending challenge. The other area which hasn't been an issue at Treasury, because we managed to quite early on get project management support, is just providing that sort of neat structure so that all of those sort of targets which I had on the screen just before are all managed as part of individual discrete projects, with accountabilities really clear and roadmaps developed so that everyone's really clear about what's going to happen and when, who's involved, and what decisions need to be made. And that structure, if you don't have it, can leave you really gasping for air, because as you can see, there's a lot of activity. I think there's 13 targets plus a couple of other internal roadmaps around things. And if you don't have that structure and that good governance, it can be a real challenge to moving ahead. And so, I'd suggest that's equally as important as having the strategy itself, is how you manage the strategy.
And actually, the next question is alluding to exactly that. I think you've partially answered it already. But how are you going to monitor progress on the quantitative stuff? Do you have data systems or processes? So you've touched on that. I don't know if you've got anything to add to what you've just said.
Yeah, look, I think we certainly have data systems. Are we looking to do more interesting things with them? Completely. And to give you an example, automation of what you can automate just makes complete sense, so that you don't, you can eliminate lots of risk from your business and time lags, for example, if you can automate your electricity data, so that you don't have to wait, A, to get an invoice, B, for someone to get the invoice and then put it into the system. And then you have the risk of them putting the system slightly differently than what was on the bill and not finding out for a little while, and all those sorts of things. And things like that just make your business run smarter and simpler, and allow you to, make better decisions. And so some of the sort of energy management platforms and the things like that, you can look at in real time about how efficiently your kit's operating. You can do preemptive maintenance. You can do all sorts of interesting stuff, as well as moving into things like demand management and all those sorts of pieces. And so I think investment in systems is absolutely critical part of the equation, and that, it actually frees up, your people to do what they do best, rather than trying to kind of, cater for the system, have the system work for you.
Yeah, and I imagine initially it is quite resource heavy. You need the people on the ground to make something like this happen. So automation where you can, imagine, would be a huge bonus. We've got exactly. A couple more questions through, Michael. So this one's more of, I think, a reflection and your opinion. In European countries, they have a good rinse and return system for glass bottles. Do you think this system would work in the domestic Australian market? Reuse as a better option than recycling? And yeah, it's a really good point, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I remember putting the milk bottles out the front on every night, and getting the new ones in the morning. So it obviously has worked in the past, but I think in terms of the scale of the wine business versus milk, there's obviously some differences there. But I think Tesco in the UK is doing some really interesting stuff with a company called Loop, which is essentially that sort of model where you have refillable containers. And I don't think they're doing wine yet, but it's things like dishwashing liquid and toothpaste and foundation and all those sorts of pieces. Mm-hmm. I think that works really well in a place like London, where there's a very large concentrated population, and you don't have to transport, if you like, the unfilled containers and then clean them up and then transport them back and do all those sorts of things. I'm dubious in a country like Australia that is fairly dispersed geographically about whether the net carbon benefit would be there. If we were to go down a similar route, I feel like it's probably a bit challenging. I think there's probably more hope in some of the refillable bottles at on-premise sales and things like that could be more of the near-term opportunity. Would be my suspicion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then the only other point just on that one, I guess, is there's been an industry trend, if you like, for the most part, towards lightweighting of bottles for good reason. If you're going down the refillable route, you probably need to make them, sturdier, which therefore means more glass, more carbon. And so, like that sort of old example, if you like, between plastic bags and paper bags, and how many times you need to use the plastic bag versus the paper bag to make it work. I think that if you weren't getting those sort of good return rates, it'd definitely be significantly worse for the carbon balance.
Excellent, great points. Another question I have about fostering healthy and inclusive communities. Could you tell us more about the advocacy strategy to emphasise consumer health by wine marketing, and what society background used to plan to create inclusive communities? Why target women leading?
So maybe if I...
it's a lot in that.
Yeah, deal with them probably three parts. I think... as a business, we believe in, inclusion, equity and diversity. And so having 50% of our women as senior leaders just makes perfect sense to us. And we really think that we should, reflect the communities and the markets in which we operate. and that is, part of being an equitable business. And so we think that sort of target is entirely appropriate, as is trying to increase the proportion of women in our field workforce, or the overall business, which has been traditionally sort of male dominated, as well as on the board. And so we want that to sort of permeate every layer of our business. And that's sort of aligned, I guess, if you like, with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is all about trying to empower and give equality to both genders. Now, in terms of the alcohol approach, the responsible drinking approach,
yes, consumer health. Yep.
Yeah, the consumer health. So that's currently, a bit of work we've got underway, where we're looking at each of our kind of key markets and how, the emerging research, as well as the policy environment is shaping up in that. We do think that, at times some of the industry can be too competitive to the anti-alcohol lobby, and that there are, probably places of agreement where we can, more effectively target our investment around, consumer health and responsible drinking. And that review, which we're doing over the course of this year, is designed to try and uncover those for us. I think there's obviously more that the industry can do in this space, and we're keen to play our part. Does that cover off all the questions, Prue? Sorry,
I think so. Quinguru, if you want further clarification or further answer, please just add it into the chat. We've got another question. I think we're going okay for time. Do you find people in operations versus the office are any different in terms of engagement, buy-in, resources and opinions? Keen to hear more about how you approached it and how did you balance it all? So I guess different mindsets across the different areas of the business.
Yeah, look, it's
getting their buy-in.
And being completely transparent, as I sort of said when I started, I'm dialing in from Melbourne, and most of Treasury's assets aren't in Melbourne. And because of COVID lockdowns and the like, I'm still yet to do my induction over in South Australia and spend time directly with a lot of the people that do work in our sort of field workforce, and on VIDI in particular. But through the wonders of this digital technology, I've spent a lot of time with them, working through things like our approach to water and climate adaptation and the like. And I think more often than not, there's great alignment in the thinking of people like me who come out with a sustainability lens, and those people who work in those jobs where they're actively managing sustainability on a day-to-day basis. They may not call it that; it's just part of what they do. But I think there's been very good alignment, and I would say just generally across Treasury. Whenever there's a town hall or any of those sort of leader Q&As, sustainability is always one of those topics, regardless of where people work, that they're just really interested in finding out more and asking what we're doing about this and asking more questions and how they get involved. And, that's a great environment to be in. And I think it's, really true to the wine industry that, I think, as I said in my presentation, that, they've long been stewards of the land and the water. And
absolutely, we're reliant on it.
Exactly. So
it wouldn't exist without it.
Exactly. So I think it attracts people of a similar ilk, right? Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, if no one else has any questions, we're going to let Michael have a break, and we'll wrap things up for today. Thank you again, Michael, for your time and some really, really fantastic insight. As I said, aspirational content as to what industry can do and the fantastic things that Treasury are doing. And I wish you all the best with achieving those goals. First one's in 2023, is that right?
2022 is when we've got some first goals hitting, which we're keenly focused on. So
fantastic.
Thank you very much, Prue. It's been great to be here, and thanks for your time, everyone.
My pleasure. So before everyone goes, just a reminder that the WCA webinar program will continue throughout 2022. So our next one's coming up on Tuesday, the 8th of March, bringing regional brands to life, presented by Barossa Grape Wine and Tourism Association. And registrations for that one will be open on the WCA website later this week, so keep an eye out for it. For all WCA members, our recordings from any previous webinars are accessible via our website under the Education Centre section. If you have any suggestions on webinar topics you'd like us to cover in future months, please email me at wca@winecommunicators.com.au. Thanks again for joining us, everyone. Stay safe, and we hope to see you back online again next month. That's all from me. Thanks.